She's too soft for you. You need someone who can actually keep up. I heard my best friend's voice through the thin wall of my own kitchen, low and deliberate. The way she always spoke when she was absolutely certain she was right. I had stepped away from my own birthday dinner to grab another bottle of wine from the pantry, and now I stood frozen in the hallway, the cold glass pressed against my palm, listening to her dismantle me for the man I loved. Claire has a good heart, my boyfriend said, and the hesitation before those words told me everything. He didn't say I love her. He didn't say don't talk about her like that. He said she has a good heart, the way you describe a golden retriever. A good heart doesn't build a life, my best friend replied. You've been with her for 4 years, Daniel. 4 years and she's still doing freelance graphic work from her kitchen table. She doesn't even have a proper portfolio website. You have a real career now. You need someone who matches that. There was a silence that stretched just long enough to confirm that Daniel was thinking about it. Actually weighing her words against our 4 years together, our shared apartment lease, the trip to Nova Scotia we'd already half planned for the summer. Rachel, he said finally, and there was something different in how he said her name. Not cautious. Warm. I set the wine bottle down on the hallway shelf without making a sound and walked back into my own birthday party with a smile I had learned to wear in situations where falling apart wasn't an option. I clinked glasses with my cousin. I laughed at a joke I didn't hear. And I told myself I had misunderstood. I hadn't misunderstood. The changes came quietly over the following weeks. Daniel started working late on days Rachel also stayed late. He mentioned her casually but often, the way you mention someone who is always just slightly on your mind. He stopped asking to see my new design work. He started leaving his phone face down on the counter, which he had never done before in 4 years. My older sister noticed before I admitted it to myself. Something is wrong with him, she said one Sunday afternoon, watching him across my parents' living room during a family lunch. He's somewhere else. He's just been busy, I said, because I wasn't ready yet. I became ready exactly 6 weeks after my birthday, on a Tuesday evening when I came home early from a client meeting that had been cancelled. Daniel wasn't home, which wasn't unusual. But his laptop was open on the kitchen table, the screen still lit, and the conversation sitting there in plain text was not something I could look away from fast enough. The messages between him and Rachel went back further than I wanted to count. The language had shifted from friendly to something else entirely around the same week I'd stood in that hallway listening. He had told her she was the most driven person he knew. She had told him that some people needed to be outgrown. He had not disagreed. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Long enough for the screen to go dark. Long enough to understand that this had not been impulsive. This had been a decision, made slowly, with my best friend's voice leading the way. When Daniel came home an hour later and found me still sitting there, I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just looked at him across the room and asked how long. His face told me before he spoke. It's not what you think it is, he started, which is always the beginning of a confirmation. I read the messages, I said. So please don't tell me what to think. He sat down. He used the word complicated 4 times. He said Rachel understood his ambitions in a way that was hard to explain. He said he hadn't meant for it to go this far, which implied it had gone somewhere, which I already knew. He said he still cared about me. I told him to be out of the apartment before the end of the week. When I called Rachel, she didn't apologize. She said she had tried to tell me for months that we weren't right for each other, which was a remarkable way to describe what she had actually done. She said she hoped I would understand eventually. She said sometimes people bring out better versions of each other, and she thought that was what she and Daniel had. I hung up the phone. I called my sister, who drove over with food I didn't eat and sat beside me on the floor of my bedroom while I cried through the part where you still can't believe it, and then through the part where you absolutely can. The next morning I got up, made coffee, and told myself out loud in my own kitchen. Watch what I build. I want to be clear that I said those words and felt nothing behind them yet. It was a promise made on pure stubbornness. I didn't have a plan. I had a sublet apartment I could no longer afford alone, a freelance client list that barely covered groceries, and the specific kind of hollow that comes from losing 2 people at once. I had a graphic design degree from Concordia that I had never fully used, and a portfolio that, as Rachel had been kind enough to point out, didn't even have a proper home on the internet. I gave myself until the end of the month to collapse, and then I gave myself the month after that to move. I chose Vancouver because I had a university friend there, Priya, who had been asking me to visit for 2 years and who offered her couch without a single question when I texted her at midnight. I packed what fit in my car. I left the furniture because it had been chosen for a life I was no longer living, and I drove west on the Trans-Canada with a coffee that went cold somewhere past Thunder Bay. Vancouver received me with rain, which felt appropriate. Priya's apartment was small and warm and full of plants, and she fed me soup the first night and didn't ask me to explain myself until I was ready. I was ready around day 4. I found a room in East Vancouver within the week, in a shared house with 2 other people who worked odd hours and kept mostly to themselves, which suited me perfectly. The rent was manageable if I landed 2 steady clients, which meant I needed to land 2 steady clients immediately. I rebuilt my portfolio website in 4 days, working on Priya's kitchen table from early morning until my eyes gave out. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. And it showed work I had done rather than work I had almost done. The first response came from a small sustainable packaging company in Kitsilano that needed a brand refresh. The founder, a woman named Dani, met me at a coffee shop on West 4th and spent 20 minutes looking at my work before she said, "I don't want safe. I want interesting." I told her safe was the one thing I had never been accused of being. She laughed and hired me. The referral from that project led to another, and that one led to a mid-sized tech startup in Yaletown that needed a full visual identity built from scratch. I was working 16-hour days inside of 3 months, surviving on coffee and the particular clarity that comes from having nothing to fall back on. It was at the tech startup's office, during a brand strategy meeting I had been invited to join as a vendor, that I first encountered Thomas. He was their newly contracted business development consultant, brought in to help them position for a Series A raise, and he arrived 12 minutes late to that meeting with a takeout cup of coffee and an apology that was direct and unrehearsed. He sat across the table from me, scanned my work on the screen behind me, and said, "Did you design those yourself?" With the straightforward interest of someone who actually wanted to know the answer. "I did," I said. "They're really good," he said, with the same tone he would have used to say the coffee was hot. Just a fact. I noticed that. Our professional relationship began practically. He passed my name to 2 other startups he was advising that needed branding work. I sent him client communication templates I had built because their marketing materials had made me wince. We emailed. Then we got coffee. Then coffee became lunch, and lunch became the kind of long Saturday afternoon conversation where you look up and realize it's already dark outside and neither of you has noticed. Thomas had grown up in Winnipeg, moved to Vancouver for university, and built his consulting practice from a single client referral and 4 years of relentless follow-through. His father had wanted him to take over the family hardware business. They were still working through what it meant that he hadn't. He told me this not as a complaint but as an honest accounting of where he came from, and I offered him something equally honest in return. My mother had always believed my older sister was the practical one, the one with the real plan, and I had spent most of my 20s half believing she was right. He didn't offer me reassurance, which I appreciated. He just said, "And now?" I said I was still finding out. He said that seemed like the right answer. 6 months after that conversation, Thomas asked me to come in as creative director on a branding consultancy he was building. Not as a vendor. As a partner. "You'd be giving up your independence," I told him, because I wanted to name the thing I was afraid of. "You'd be gaining infrastructure," he said. "And I'd be getting someone who actually understands how people see things, which is the part I'm terrible at." "You're not terrible at it. I'm competent at it at best," he said. "You're genuinely good at it." "That's a different thing." I told him I needed a week to think. I used 4 days. We named the company Meridian Creative, which neither of us loved entirely but which felt honest, a line you navigate by. We worked out of his home office for the first 4 months, with a shared calendar, a joint business account, and a rule that we would not take a client whose values we couldn't actually defend out loud. The rule cost us 2 early prospects and 1 significant retainer. We kept the rule. The moment things shifted from professional to something more complicated happened on a Wednesday evening in February, during a working dinner that had stopped being about work around the 2nd hour. Thomas said something genuinely funny about an investor pitch gone sideways, and I laughed in a way that surprised me, the full, unguarded kind, and he looked at me for a moment longer than the joke required, and I looked back, and we both understood something had changed without saying so. We said so 3 days later, because we were both too old to pretend otherwise. This could complicate everything, I told him, which was the responsible thing to say. It could, he agreed. I'd rather deal with complicated than ignore something real. We were careful about it. We did not make announcements to clients. We did not let disagreements about work bleed into anything personal, or the other way around. We developed a rule about not resolving business arguments and personal arguments in the same conversation, which required discipline, and also became one of the more useful things I have learned in my adult life. He proposed on a camping weekend near Tofino, in the rain, with no ring because he had lost the ring in his jacket pocket and couldn't find it until the next morning. He said he had a ring somewhere in this tent and would I please say yes before it emerged so the question wasn't contingent on the object. I said yes. We found the ring in his sleeping bag the following morning. We married the following spring at a small ceremony in Vancouver, with Priya as my witness and Thomas's brother Marcus as his, and dinner afterward at a Japanese restaurant on Robson Street where the owner recognized Thomas from a branding project we had done for a neighboring business and brought us a bottle of sake we hadn't ordered. To building things worth building, Thomas said, lifting his glass. The first 2 years of the business were not easy. We operated lean, reinvesting every dollar we could, which meant our apartment served double duty as office and home for longer than was comfortable. I learned accounting out of necessity. Thomas learned enough about visual storytelling to be useful in client meetings without overstepping into my area, which was a negotiation we had to have explicitly and more than once. Our first anchor client was a regional grocery chain looking to compete with larger national brands through a stronger local identity. I designed them a full brand system. Thomas restructured their marketing contracts. The project ran 6 months and was difficult and transformative for both sides. And when it ended, the CEO referred us to 2 other mid-sized retailers in BC and Alberta. We moved into proper office space in Gastown in our 3rd year. Not large, but real, with a boardroom that didn't double as anything else and a small team of 4 that grew to 9 by the following year. The thing about building something over a long stretch of time is that you stop measuring your life against the people who doubted you, mostly because you no longer have the bandwidth for that comparison. I had not spoken to Rachel or Daniel since the year I left. My sister had kept me loosely informed. She had always been closer to neutral than partisan, but I had stopped asking. I had made a life that had nothing to do with them, and that life had filled every room that the loss had emptied. I learned they were struggling on a Tuesday in March, in the same mundane way you learn most things. An offhand comment over a phone call with my sister, who mentioned Rachel's marketing agency had laid off half its staff after a major account walked, and that Daniel had left his firm under circumstances she described as awkward without elaborating. They were still together. Things were, she said carefully, strained. I stayed with how that felt for a moment and discovered it felt like almost nothing. Not satisfaction. Not relief. Just a kind of distant acknowledgement, the way you note rain through someone else's window. Thomas and I were in the middle of planning an anniversary gala for Meridian Creative's 5th year of operation. We held one every 2 years, a gathering of clients, collaborators, and community partners that had become one of the better evenings on our professional calendar. The venue that year was a heritage event space in Yaletown, and the evening was built around something we had started calling a Changemaker recognition, an award we gave to 3 clients each cycle whose work had genuinely moved something in their industry. Priya handled our guest list coordination. 3 weeks before the event, she came to my office with her laptop and a mildly apologetic expression and said, "There is a Claire situation in the invites." The invitation list included representatives from every agency and firm we had worked with in BC and Alberta. Among them, through a subcontracting relationship I had not looked closely at, was the name of Daniel's current employer and, in the column listing their accompanying guests, Rachel, who now ran the agency's communication function. "Do we want to flag this?" Priya asked. I looked at the names on the screen for a moment. "Leave them on the list," I said. That evening I sat with Thomas at our kitchen table and told him everything I had never fully detailed. Rachel's voice through the wall, the messages on Daniel's laptop, the birthday dinner that had ended my old life. He had known the broad shape of it, the way you know the outline of a country without having visited. Now I showed him the interior. He listened without interruption, which is one of the things I have most valued about him. When I finished, he said, "Do you want to withdraw their invitation?" "No." "Do you want to seat them somewhere specific?" I almost smiled. "No." I just want you to know why they're in the room, so you're not surprised if something is strange. Nothing will be strange, he said. You built this. They're guests in it. I chose my dress for that evening with more intention than I usually applied to these things. A deep navy wrap dress, clean and assured, the kind that requires no explanation. Thomas wore a gray suit. We arrived early enough to greet the first guests, and I stood at the entrance of that heritage space and felt completely, solidly at home in it. I saw them before they saw me. Rachel entered in a cream blazer that had been expensive once, followed by Daniel, who was wearing a tie I remembered helping him pick out for a job interview years ago. They stood just inside the entrance and looked around the room with the slightly careful expression of people who have not been to a gathering quite like this before and are working out where they fit within it. I did not move toward them. I was in conversation with a client and her husband about their upcoming expansion into Ontario. And I let that conversation be exactly what it was, unhurried and genuine, until Rachel and Daniel had made their way around the room far enough to arrive at where I was standing. Rachel saw me first. Her expression did something complicated in a short span of time, moving through surprise, calculation, and the particular composure she had always been good at. "Claire," she said, and smiled with the full warmth of someone who had decided in advance to be gracious. "You look wonderful." "Thank you," I said evenly. "I'm glad you could make it." I introduced Thomas. Rachel extended her hand to him with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to professional gatherings, saying she had followed Meridian Creative's growth with real admiration. "Everything here is a collaboration," Thomas said pleasantly. "Claire builds the vision and the systems. I would have a much harder time describing what I actually do without her framing it." Daniel had been standing one step behind Rachel. He said hello to me, and there was something careful and tired in it. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere and found it was not what he had come for. "It's a beautiful event," he offered. "It's been a good 5 years," I said. Priya appeared at my elbow to tell me the Changemaker presentation was 10 minutes out, and I excused myself with a warmth I did not have to manufacture, because the truth was I no longer felt anything jagged in their presence. Just a faint residual clarity, the way you remember clearly that something once hurt without being hurt by the memory. Thomas gave the welcome address and spoke about what the word meridian had come to mean for us, the point from which you take your bearings, the line you return to when you've drifted off course. He talked about building work that held values inside the structure, not as decoration. He thanked our team by name, and when he referenced my work, he did it the way he always did, accurately, without embellishment, in a way that made it undeniable. I watched Rachel's face during that section. The composure was intact, but the eyes were doing the calculation. Later in the evening, at the edge of the dessert table, Rachel found me alone for a moment. "You've really built something here," she said, and I believed she meant it. "I always knew you had more in you than you thought." I considered that for a moment. "I think I always knew too," I said. "It just took leaving to find the space to use it." She held her drink with both hands. "Daniel and I are going through a transition," she said, which was a careful way to say several things at once. "His firm restructured. Mine has been. It's been a difficult year." She looked at me. "If there were ever opportunities to collaborate, or if you ever needed someone with my background in communications, I hope things stabilize for you," I said, and I meant that also. "Our hiring goes through Priya. She keeps track of what we need." She nodded once, slowly. I went back to the table where our team was celebrating, and I sat down next to Thomas, and he put his hand over mine on the table without making anything of it. We stayed until the last guests left, which was our habit at these things, and then we walked the 7 blocks home because the spring evening had decided to be mild and clear and we were both too full of good feeling to rush it. "How are you?" Thomas asked, somewhere around the 3rd block. "Good," I said, and the simplicity of it surprised me. "Genuinely good. Not in a performed way." I noticed. "The strange thing," I said, "is that I thought I might feel something more obvious. Satisfaction, maybe. Or some final closing of a door." I paused. Instead, I just felt grateful. For what? That it happened. All of it. I found his hand and held it. If none of that had fallen apart, I would have stayed. I would have gone on building a smaller version of this life for someone who was already looking past me. I wouldn't have driven to Vancouver. I wouldn't have rebuilt the portfolio. I would never have been in that meeting room. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You would have found your way eventually. Maybe. But this way was mine." I looked up at the sky, which had a faint unusual clarity to it, the kind that only comes on certain spring nights when the mountains are fully visible at the edge of the city. They thought they were leaving me behind. They were actually just clearing the path. Thomas stopped walking, right there on the sidewalk, and pulled me into a hug that didn't require anything from it except to be what it was. Later, sitting at our kitchen table with the leftovers from the catering that Priya had insisted we bring home, I understood something I hadn't quite put into words before that evening. The thing I had needed from that room was not their shock, or their regret, or any visible proof that I had won something. What I had needed, without knowing it, was simply to stand in the life I had built and find that it was solid. That it did not shift or wobble when they walked into it. It didn't. And the version of me who had stood frozen in a hallway on her own birthday, holding a bottle of wine, listening to her future being quietly negotiated without her, that woman had driven west on a highway in the rain and built something that could hold the weight of a full life. Not because someone finally saw her worth. Because she had stopped waiting for that and gone to find out for herself.